and welcome to this episode of China Edge, brought to you by the SupChina team. I'm your host, Lizzie, an MIT-trained economist turned journalist here at Wall Street TV, who covers China and its relation to the world. At China Edge, we go beyond the headlines and guide you, our audience, through the jungle of Chinese regulations. We also go deep into industry trends and identify challenges and opportunities in the Chinese market. Today's episode is very special. As we know, we are only a few months away from the 20th Party Congress. So what will be the makeup of the top decision-making body, the Politburo and its standing committee? Who will be China's next premier? What policy changes should we expect to see during Xi Jinping's norm-breaking third term, which at this point seems all but secure? Joining me to discuss this very important topic is Victor Shi, professor of Chinese political economy at UCSD, an expert on elite politics of China. Professor Shi is also author of the book Coalitions of the Weak, Elite Politics in China, from Mao's Stratagem to the Rise of Xi. Thank you so much, Professor Shi, for being here with me.
Thank you for having me, Lizzie.
So, Professor Shi, I'm going to start by asking you to help me understand the title of your book, Coalitions of the Weak. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, very quickly. So the book actually is mainly about the late Mao period. Of course, we all know that Mao ruled for life, so he never had to retire. What was the magic of his rule for life? The traditional thinking is that he pursued factionalism, i.e. he promoted people who had been loyal to him all throughout their careers as part of his support coalition. But it turns out that that was not the case. And we kind of all intuitively knew that because Lin Biao, of course, his most loyal follower, ended up betraying him and ended up dying in 1971. What Mao did instead was to collect a coalition of officials who could never challenge his power, either because they have such a deep stain in their records for historical crimes, or because they're too junior and too inexperienced to challenge his power. So the book just talks about, if you want to be a dictator for life, one very secure path of achieving that is to form a coalition of the weak. And I guess we'll see whether Xi Jinping does the same thing as he contemplates rule for life.
Right. And, as we know, you study Chinese leaderships across multiple generations. From where you stand, what do you see as the most salient change during Xi Jinping's first two terms compared with his predecessors?
So the biggest change has to be the fact that there's a lot less balance of power between different powerful factions. So basically, the rulers of China up through 2012 had been appointed by the revolutionary generation. The generation revolutionaries who founded the Chinese Communist Party, who pursued the communist revolution until victory in 1949. They were still in charge of Chinese politics until the early 1990s. And they personally appointed Jiang Zemin first, but also Hu Jintao, right? So they put Hu Jintao in a place that would entitle him to more or less automatic promotion into the Secretary General position in 2002, after most of them had died. So Xi Jinping really was the first. So as a result of this appointment by the elders, and they had always meant for there to be a power sharing at the top. So it's in a speech in 1989, actually right after Jiang Zemin's appointment, Deng Xiaoping personally said, and this is a public speech. It wasn't even a secret speech of Deng Xiaoping. He publicly, now we know what he said at the time was that they want a collective leadership for China. Because if one leader of China were to deviate too much, at least the other can pull this person back, and no single leader is too powerful. Of course, Xi Jinping, when he took power, it was well after the death of most. There's still one or two of these revolutionaries left. I guess they're like 100 or whatever, but the vast majority had passed away by 2012. When he took power, he was able to totally consolidate power in a way that would have been impossible in the 1980s and in the 1990s and even the 2000s, because there was this power sharing arrangement So I think that's the biggest change.
Hi, this is Lizzie, host of the China Edge show. We have prepared both English and Chinese subtitles for the show. You can turn on subtitles by clicking the CC icon at the bottom of your YouTube video. Click on the gear icon and select from one of the three languages: English, Chinese Simplified, and Chinese Traditional. 大家好，这里是李琦。在 China Edge 节目中，我们为您准备了中英双语字幕，请您按照屏幕上的指示打开齿轮图标，选择需要的语言，然后选择 CC 按钮，打开字幕，这样就可以看到有字幕的节目了。
That's the biggest change.
Right, and one part of that consolidation of power is consolidation of economic management, which traditionally was relegated to the Premier of China. That brought us to sort of the second part of our interview. As we know, Premier Li Keqiang is set to retire after this upcoming leadership reshuffle. So who are the leading contenders for China's next premier? Can you tell us a little bit about their career trajectories and what you think of them?
Yeah, so right now I think it's down to one of a few people, three people, I would say. First is Wang Yang, currently the chair of the CPPCC. In my mind, Wang Yang is the most qualified. If you just look at a straight sort of qualification, Wang Yang had been provincial party secretaries in several provinces, ending in Guangdong province, which of course is an economic powerhouse. He was vice premier, actually in charge of agriculture and trade, which is a very important portfolio. And then he, of course, has been in the Politburo Standing Committee in the past 5 years as chair of the CPPCC. Actually, he also has been in charge of the Xinjiang portfolio, so which internationally may give him some issues. But nonetheless, prior to the CPPCC appointment, he just had built up such a very impressive administrative record. Never did anything wrong. I mean, so in China, it's very important to not do anything that wrong. So I think in my mind, he's the most qualified. He's also at an age where he can serve another 5 years in the Politburo Standing Committee. So he could serve for 5 more years. Another candidate is a younger person who also is very qualified, Hu Chunhua, who's currently in the Politburo, but a vice premier right now, and then previously also provincial party secretary in several provinces, and then earlier than that in the Youth League. He's younger. If he were to become premier, he can serve for 10 years. So that potentially will give policies some stability in China. And then finally, Li Qiang, who is the secretary of Shanghai. And of course, a lot of people are not so happy about his recent performance. But nonetheless, he has very close ties to Xi Jinping. So unlike Wang Yang or Hu Chunhua, he definitely comes out of Xi Jinping's faction. He was Xi Jinping's personal secretary back when Xi Jinping was in Zhejiang province. And he has since enjoyed just rapid series of promotion, culminating to his appointment in the Politburo and as Shanghai party secretary. That is a very important job, of course, Shanghai being the biggest city, certainly economically biggest city in China. And of course, his most recent performance may not be so satisfactory, but up to that point, I think he has been doing a good job in the eyes of Xi Jinping. So I think he also has a chance of becoming the next premier of China. Well, I think Li Qiang is a kind of a surprise candidate because typically, because the job of running the state machine, remember the premier of China runs the state council with all the many ministries and commissions and offices, etc. It is a very complex job. China is a big country. China has one of the biggest government in the world, if not the biggest government in the world, both in terms of the number of people who work for it and also in terms of the number of specialization. So the job is extremely complex. So for someone who has never worked in the state council like Li Qiang to suddenly take over as the next premier, that is not unprecedented. This is kind of what Zhao Ziyang did back in the early 1980s. And, he did sort of an okay job. But it's certainly, we haven't seen something like that for many, many years. So for him to take over as premier would be pretty unusual.
And another name that is frequently in international media is Liu He, the Harvard-educated economic czar of Xi Jinping, who's believed to be Xi Jinping's right-hand person in terms of economic management. He was viewed as a force of stability during the very treacherous years of the Trump administration. So who's likely to take over Liu He's role in future bilateral economic negotiations with the United States?
So there's very strong rumors that this guy He Lifeng, who's currently the head of the National Development and Reform Commission, which is a very powerful agency, of course, will take over Liu He's job. Um, if you look at on paper, He Lifeng is very qualified. He worked in Guangdong province for a number of years. Of course, economically a powerhouse. Then he was in Tianjin, one of the biggest cities in China, first as the head of Binhai, and then as the Tianjin party secretary. And then finally, this position in the NDRC, one of the most powerful agencies in the state council. So it's fairly natural for someone like with that kind of paper record to end up as the vice premier of China. He's actually going into the job. I would say he's much more experienced than Liu He was when he first entered that job. Because Liu He, remember, he had been a think tanker throughout most of his career. Never, that's one of the complaints that I heard in Beijing, actually, when Liu He was first appointed, that he never ran anything in his life, not a major economic entity, in terms of ministry or province. So he doesn't have the intuition for a lot of the problems that are faced by provincial party secretaries or city mayors. Whereas He Lifeng is going to have a lot of intuition behind that. But that's part of the problem with the He Lifeng appointment, though, is that the intuition of a provincial party secretary or of a city mayor is to borrow as much money as possible. So on the one hand, this is actually quite good for growth potentially. So Liu He, as we all know, one of his big policy priorities was deleveraging, right. Control the amount of borrowing. He was fairly successful in that, but the result is that growth in China is not ideal at this point. And especially in the real estate sector, there's all kinds of distress situations or bankruptcies, defaults, et cetera, et cetera. He Lifeng will know how to boost things up. But of course, that will create a medium-term problem of higher debt, right? So in the short term, I see He Lifeng's appointment, if it is to be him, to be quite positive for growth. But in the medium term, then China goes back to the usual, leveraging up, to generate short-term growth, but then you have to deal with long-term debt. So Tianjin, which He Lifeng administered over for many years, is the place with one of the highest debt levels in China. Just trillions and trillions of renminbi in debt. Empty buildings in Binhai district. I've been to many of them. Completely empty. Like skyscrapers, 40 stories high. Maybe one office on the first floor, and then the rest of it empty. Still is like that, as far as I can tell. So it's on paper, it sounds like a really good appointment, but there could be some issues in the medium term.
Right, fantastic. And then I wanted to turn back to Xi Jinping himself. What kind of changes or trends do you expect in the next 5-year term of Xi Jinping's leadership compared with the previous two?
So the question is in the Politburo Standing Committee whether he's going to completely dominate or just mildly dominate, right? So, well, I wouldn't say mildly. He already pretty completely dominates the Chinese government in the upper echelon. But whether he's going to, as we say in Chinese, 清一色, right? So like really completely appoint his own people in the Politburo Standing Committee. So right now, if we go by the rule of 67, you can stay, 68, you have to retire, which is the informal rule for high-level Chinese government officials. Then Li Keqiang, Wang Yang, and Wang Huning, who are 67, they should be able to stay in the Politburo Standing Committee. Li Keqiang, we know that he has to take a different position, maybe head of the NPC, head of the CPPCC, whatever. But of course, Xi Jinping being so powerful, he can change the rule. He can say, well, guess what? If you're 66, you can stay. But if you're 67, you have to retire. If he institute this new rule, then Li Keqiang, Wang Yang, Wang Huning would have to retire. More people from his own faction, like Cai Qi and Chen Minar and people like that can be promoted in the Politburo Standing Committee. I would say that's, even though intuitively it feels like the right thing to do for a powerful politician like him, that would not be the smart thing to do. The Chinese economy is not in the greatest shape, as we know. there could be, recession or some kind of mini, at least financial crisis. I think it behooves Xi Jinping to appoint someone who's not in his faction to be the premier of China, certainly, so that he can blame any problem on that person. But who knows what he's going to do?
Right, who knows? And finally, this is looking further beyond in the future. Given how many norms Xi Jinping has broken, how do you expect the next round of succession to unfold? What's going to happen after Xi?
Yeah, I think that is the problem, right? It's going to be extremely difficult to kind of ex ante, before Xi were to pass away, appoint a successor. Once you become a complete dictator, as Mao did, you can't credibly appoint a successor because, let's say you designate a successor, this person becomes already very powerful even before you die, then you're forced to purge that person. Mao had to do that a couple of times, with Liu Shaoqi and also with Lin Biao. He had to ex ante purge the so-called designated successors because they became too powerful. Or you appoint someone who's very, very weak. And so Mao ended up doing that. But then, someone like Wang Hongwen, even before he passed away, Mao could see that Wang Hongwen was just too weak. He had been a worker prior to the Cultural Revolution, no political experience, no ties with the military, no ties with the security apparatus. So even though Mao kind of wanted a young person like Wang Hongwen to be the next leader of China, he knew that he couldn't make it. And then finally settled on Hua Guofeng, who was pretty weak, but not so weak as Wang Hongwen. So it's a very tricky thing. So I think for Xi Jinping, he is already on a path for lifetime dictatorship. He will have to go through a couple of iterations of picking successors and failing. And God forbid, like if the first person who's chosen by Xi to be successor, that's I don't want to say a death sentence, but it's close to a death sentence, I would say.
Right. If you enjoy our discussions here, I'm sure you would find value in our new powerful marketplace tool for investors, also called China Edge. It tracks, distills, and analyzes both Chinese language and English language materials about Chinese companies, business leaders, and government entities, and reviews the often hidden links between them. For our YouTube viewers, we are offering a limited time 50% discount. Just go to the link you see on the screen and use the code EDGE50. Also, sign up for the China Edge newsletter. It's a daily 2-minute rundown of China business news you don't want to miss. The link is right here on the screen. You can also click on the link in the video's description section to get your complimentary subscription today.